Three, two, one. Hey guys, welcome back to the Foam Frat podcast. We're going to talk about the anion gap. And I don't know why, but just that name is like super intimidating to people. I think it's because it's got the word anion in it. I don't think it's the gap part of it that scares people away, but it takes you back to like fifth grade science and the cations and the anions. And I don't think it's taught well. I don't think we do a good job of explaining it in paramedic school. And if I had to boil it down, I would say maybe the last 5 years, my explanation and my understanding of the anion gap has increased drastically. Would you agree? Do you feel like it just is not taught that well in school?
No, it's not. And I think it's because nobody teaches the Stewart method of acid base. And I remember when you and I first started looking into that and we bought the textbook and all that kind of stuff. And I remember thinking back because like one of the first things you learn in there is kind of contrary to what you've always been taught. And they tell you that there's an equal amount of positives and negatives, cations and anions. I remember thinking, well, then what in the world is an anion gap? And so like as I was starting to learn this new one, the old one just became more and more confusing. And I'm like, God, I feel like I don't know anything now, And so yeah, it just became more and more confusing.
Yeah, and then you had people that would say, well, you gotta calculate for the albumin, and then okay, are we including the potassium or are we not including the potassium? Is a normal anion gap 12 or 16? It's just too confusing. So our goal with this video is to boil it down to what you need to know. Talk about now that we are able to measure specific ions inside the plasma, how that's changed some of the things. That used to be that there was all this stuff you couldn't measure. And so that gap was understandably larger. But the first thing we want to lay out there is that there's no gap. It's a figurative gap. It's a make-believe gap. And Sam illustrates this with some nerds and my son and Candy in the blog. And I think we can hit that right away and just have you explain why is that not an actual gap?
Yeah, it's just based on what you measure. So when we take a basic lab panel and you get just the stuff you'd see on like a Chem 7. So you have your sodium and chloride, and then there's like the all the stuff you see, the bicarb and the potassium, BUN, creat, glucose, and you take that basic chemistry panel. You can take that and you just take a few things, right? You just take your sodium and you subtract off of it the product of your chloride and your bicarb. It's the biggest amount of cations minus all the anions that you see on a basic chemistry panel, a Chem 7. But that's all that it is. And so obviously those aren't all the anions in the body. There's a ton more left. And then that's not all the cations either. That's just our way of approximating. And so I think in the future, as lab machines get better, we probably one day will stop talking about anion gaps, because it will just automatically measure every single thing in the blood. And it will be so good that it'll just tell you, here's all the positives, here's all the negatives. And you'll just look at a graph and be like, oh, hey, look, those aren't usually there. But right now, what we're doing is we're saying, here's all the sodium, and then you have this chloride. And then essentially what happens is something extra pops up and it squishes the bicarb. And so you got a big old stack of sodium, and then you got a little stack of bicarb, and then you got a stack of chloride. And that stack, that anion stack, gets shorter and shorter and shorter the more stuff you pile up on top of it, which is, we go over in the blog, is like all that Goldmark stuff, which I'm not going to sit here and recant, because you can look at the blog and I kind of get you more familiar with like what each of those Goldmark items is. But they squish bicarb. And so you start to see a gap between the sodium and how much the bicarb and the chloride measure up to it. And the gap between those two stacks essentially is your anion gap. It has nothing to do with there being more of one than another. It's just the stuff that we measure and how we measure it.
So if you're taking notes, the way that we measure the anion gap is sodium minus chloride minus bicarb. Sodium minus chloride minus bicarb. And that should be around 12. 12 should be the normal anion gap. But you're knowing in your head that because of the law of electrical neutrality, your cations and your anions have to equal each other. But the things that we get back on our chem panel, you take your sodium, you minus your chloride, and then you're going to minus the CO2. It doesn't say bicarb.
Right.
It says CO2. And that's because a lot of CO2 is transported on bicarb. But that's that number. So you take sodium minus chloride minus bicarb. That should be 12. It should be around that range. Now, there's things that increase that gap. And these are things that are on the anion side that we're adding in. And because of the law of neutrality, chloride and bicarb naturally have to shift lower. Usually the bicarb takes the hit on that. You don't really see chloride start to come down, but you do see the bicarb start to come down, which is naturally when you go sodium minus chloride minus bicarb. If you're only subtracting 10 instead of 22 with bicarb, you're going to have a larger space there. And so that makes you go, we need to start looking at what is increasing that gap, because a lot of the nefarious things and toxins are anions, and they're going to increase that gap. And so that's where that gold mark comes into play. And the most common case, I think, is lactate. You have a patient who is in shock, who is in respiratory distress, that lactate starts to elevate. And because the lactate is elevating, it's going to bring down the bicarb. And I love the illustration you have where you have like sodium is steel, chloride is steel, and then bicarb is made out of wood. It's like that weak buffer. It's able to buffer out.
Yeah, I asked everybody in the blog, like, think about that anion side. Think about phosphorus and think about albumin and think about chloride, all that stuff that's on the negative side. What's its buffering system? Like if the body had to get rid of it, like all it could really do is maybe like pee some out, probably. Like that's about it. Like the kidneys could probably compensate for this and urinate some out if it really needed to. But in the acute phase and even in the chronic phase, like that major thing that's going to take the hit is that thing that does have the buffering system, which is going to be the bicarbonate. And that's, really difficult for the body to handle. We were talking earlier about once that bicarbonate is down and you got a big anion gap, something's crushing that. And that's why, like you said, related it to wood, because one has a buffering system, one doesn't. That buffering system is like wood. Like you can crush it, you can rebuild it, make it into other things. Very fluid, that's like crushing wood. You crush a solid, stump. Eventually you can make some particle board out of it, rebuild it. It's very fluid, whereas the metal, a lot harder to work with. So you have this bicarbonate goes through its buffering system. Well, the anions, they're very strong. So let's say you have that lactate. And you got a big thing of lactate like above that bicarb. It's really squishing it. And then you got the chloride squishing it from the bottom. So there's very little room for this bicarbonate. That means that there is very little ability to deal with CO2 in the body. And so when you think about, let's replace that lactate with ketones, right? You got a diabetic ketoacidosis patient, and we wonder, like, why are these patients so incredibly sensitive if they lose their respiratory compensation? You take that patient who's got Kussmaul respirations, their CO2 is 20, and if it goes up to 30, it's like they crash, right? Why is that? Well, there's no room for bicarb on their anion side. They got no room to transport this stuff. They can't deal with the acidity in their system by buffering because that bicarb is being held in place by those anions that are squishing it on both sides, and they're not budging anywhere. So sometimes we wonder, like, why did they get so sensitive? That's the reason why, is just that bicarb is not there to help buffer that CO2.
It's really interesting because in the setting of like a DKA patient, beta hydroxybutyrate is the anion that's taking up that space, and you see your bicarb drop. But what's interesting is when you give that patient insulin and you get rid of the beta hydroxybutyrate, the bicarb comes up on its own, barring the patient has normal renal function. That bicarb just naturally comes right back up. And while we're on the topic of DKA, I've always wondered, so when you have a patient who is in DKA and their sodium looks super low on the labs because you have this high osmotic pressure inside the vascular system, it's pooling in all that water from the interstitial space, it dilutes out the sodium. I always wonder, like, do I need to correct my sodium, which typically, what is it? It's like 2 for every 100 milligrams per deciliter.
You're talking about the glucose correction for sodium, for diluted sodium.
Yeah, I want to
We
say
had
it's
an
like
assistant. I would ask them to look it up right now because I can't remember what it is. I don't remember what it is off the top of my head, but I know that MD Calc has an excellent corrected sodium for hyperglycemia calculator, which is what I would recommend all of you do because I can't remember what it is off the top of my head.
I want to say it's 2. I think it's 2, but don't.
Well,
quote
so
me on it.
just for those of you who don't know what we're talking about, remember that your serum osmolality is like sodium, blood urea, nitrogen, and glucose. And so when any of those rise up, you're pulling a ton of water. It becomes essentially hypertonic in the vessels. And so you're pulling a ton of free water into the vasculature. And so when that glucose gets really high, pulls water in. And if it doesn't pull any sodium or anything in with it, the sodium ends up looking low because it's diluted with water, all the water that the glucose pulled in. So if your glucose is super high, your sodium is falsely lowered. So you get a false low on your sodium.
Here's what's interesting about that, though. So I just found it. It is 2.4 millimoles per liter for every 100 milligrams of deciliter of your glucose. So if you're
so glucose goes up by 100, your sodium should go down by 2.5.
Correct, yeah, 2.
Did I just say that right?
Okay. Yep, yeah.
Okay,
but it's not. I mean, it is. They call it falsely low sodium, but it actually is a low sodium. I remember reading about this, that the reason they call it a false low sodium is because, or false hyponatremia, is because when you get rid of that sugar, it comes right back. And so they don't want people giving like hypertonic saline to try to bring that up. So it's interesting because there's nothing wrong about that lab value. Like that's our actual sodium, but it's the dynamic flow of the sequence of events that follow. You're giving insulin, it's going to come right back up. But what's cool is you can still calculate your anion gap like you normally do, because if the sodium's diluted, everything else is probably diluted as well. And so you don't get like, oh, I have to correct for the sodium, but I can leave everything else, because typically there's just a global dilutional effect because you're pulling in all that free fluid. So just something to keep in mind on the DKA patient.
Wouldn't that be like horrible if you just added one more level of complexity to DKA patients? Like now you have to think, like you have to correct for everything that's diluted. That would just make things, that would just be the straw that breaks the camel's back, man. Oh no, that's not your real sodium anymore. Oh, God, you got to correct that sodium before you do anything else. So, I see what you're saying. Like, because it's diluted, that's like everything's floating further apart. So that really is pretty much what's available to the cells. Like, and just like the bicarbonate, that should correct on its own once you're kind of replacing water into different places. And yeah, that's a really good point.
It's interesting, like the nomenclature you hear on things sometimes, like, and then understanding like the reason why, because I remember thinking that like, oh, this is a pseudo hyponatremia. And I remember thinking, okay, but if it's diluted, like, why is it actually not a real hyponatremia? Like that seems weird to me that it's a pseudo. Another weird one is when you have a patient that has multiple myeloma and their IgG proteins get elevated, they actually give you a negative anion gap because they increase the unmeasured cations. And so patients with cancer, multiple myeloma, I think it was mostly the IgG or whatever, IgA. But those ones you get I always wanted to see this, like a negative anion gap. I'd be like, what in the world? Because the majority of the anion gap is made up of what? Albumin probably. And then you got a small amount that's lactate.
Phosphate's a big one. Yeah. Albumin, phosphates. There's always a tiny bit of lactate floating around, but that doesn't account for much. Yeah, pretty much. There's some other ones in there. I'm sure you got a tiny bit of like fluoride floating around, maybe. I'm not sure. Yeah, there's some other stuff in there. If you look up like list of like complete anions, good luck. So, but there's a lot of little ones in there too. But yeah, I'm sure the majority albumin, phosphate, tiny bit of lactate. I would imagine those are the top three. I'm not sure.
It's interesting because I remember being taught that the normal anion gap was 16. And then I started seeing 12 everywhere. And I was wondering like, what's the difference between the 12 and the 16? And I came across a resource that said that when we switched to ion selective electrodes of measuring electrolytes, then it went from 16 to 12 because we could get more specific. Because before it was like, photo, or what was it, flame photometry or something like that is what they would use. And I thought that was interesting, that just because of the technology of the lab device that we're using, the lab technology, like that changes what we're able to measure. And I remember Scott Weingard doing that podcast where he talked about Stewart's acid base, and that was one of the first times I really had introduced to that. And he's like, this is the Henderson Hasselbalch is predicated on old lab techniques. Like, we can routinely measure a lactate now. We don't have to think that that's some like mysterious number that we're not able to measure. And so I agree. I think like you said, eventually this will probably be something that like is no longer a thing. Like, we'll just be able to measure trace ions of everything and be able to see. And I mean, the anion gap goes back as far as like the 1960s. Like, the first time they were used, I think they were just looking at urine actually. And it's interesting to see how it's progressed in that time period. And I totally think eventually we'll be able to see everything, and we'll be able to trace amounts of everything.
Yeah, we'll probably just start calling acidoses like based on what's causing that depression of bicarb. I wonder, we might even, if we're not even looking at the gap anymore because we're measuring everything, we might not even call it an anion gap acidosis anymore. We might call it like
exactly what it is.
Just like a ethylene glycol acidosis, and maybe like a number behind it of like how much we think it's depressing the bicarb or something. Like, I think it'll just be that specific thing. Like, oh, part of it's coming from lactate, part of it's coming from ketones, and that is what it is. And we'll just stop using this kind of, because when you say anion gap, you're just inferring that something is there. But if you could measure it directly, you don't really have to say the anion gap anymore. So yeah, I think we'll get to that point. But until then, we kind of got to understand this thing, understand what's sitting in there, and understand why that's making the patient sick, and kind of what they're sensitive to.
Awesome, man. Yeah. All right. So if you have not checked out the blog, we'll link to it in the show notes to this podcast. Sam goes through the entire Goldmark criteria. That's also on our acid base, or our lab card. We talk about what Goldmark is, why we aren't using Mudpile anymore. Actually, I don't think we talk about why we're not using it. We just don't use it anymore.
No. I just don't like cat Mudpiles. Just sounds, I just don't like it. But yeah, Goldmark's better anyway. But yeah, you guys will see it in the blog.
Awesome, man. All right. Good post, dude.
Well, before we get out of here, I want to ask you how you feel about the CO2 clinic that we just did.
Oh, dude, I thought
You've been on really camera all day.
I know. I'm getting sick of talking. You see how fast I'm ready to hop off here? No, I thought the CO2 clinic went really well. I mean, we had a total of like 55 in attendance, which is that's kind of around the number we wanted. You don't want it too much because then people feel like they can't participate. But the flow felt good. I really liked zeroing in on one topic and just completely unpacking all the different components of it. But my favorite part of it is, like, I felt like on all of the talks, we tried to not get too nitty gritty into the science, but also showing the application to the field. And I think sometimes you can, when you're like, oh my God, we got to talk 3 hours about CO2, like we're going to have to get real detailed. Not really. Like, there's so much we do in resuscitation that deals with a thorough working understanding of CO2 clearance and transport. And you can't not talk about oxygenation and shunts and dead space. So I think it was a lot of fun. Like I said, I think we should take it on the road and do it at one of these conferences or something.
Yeah. So yeah, you guys will see more clinics come out. We kind of have like a pseudo schedule for, what we kind of want to do with them, but you guys will see more of those popping up along with the workbooks that we do and stuff. Do you feel like you know as much as you'll ever know about CO2 related things, like right now?
Kind of.
Dude, all this stuff that we've done. We did the acid base workbook, and then we did the capnography workbook, which who would have known that would turn into like 60 pages. And then we made separate talks to run a clinic specifically on CO2. Like, I'm sure that as time goes on, we'll pick up little things. But it's like one of those, you just get that feeling about certain topics when you've been like absorbed in it for a while. You're like, I don't know how much I will learn about this in the future. We're probably at the top of our CO2 game right now.
Yeah, we'll forget more than we learn
from here. But no, I thought it was a lot of fun too, and I'm looking forward to one we do next. We were tossing around maybe an oxygenation workbook, and clinic next, or something along those lines, maybe gas laws or something. But we'll keep you guys updated. And if you attended, thank you so much. Really appreciate the support. And even though did you see those pictures that were posted? Who posted those? You or Brian?
I think Brian posted one, and I posted.
Brian posted. Brian tends to get me when I'm looking crabby. Like, I swear to God, we had a good time.
Here's the thing about you, dude. You are very not photogenic when you don't know you're being a picture's being taken.
Dude, do I? Because Kristen tells me that I just have this listening face that looks like I'm pissed off.
No, if you know you're getting your picture taken, I mean, this is probably most people, but if you know you're getting your picture taken, you're very photogenic. But because I was like, all right, I'm going to get a picture of like him and I on the screen and everything for to put up on Facebook. And I like had a screenshot all set up, and I'm like waiting for you to like look at the camera like a normal human being. And as soon as I snap it, and when you edit this, you have to throw this picture in there. But as soon as I snap it, man, you're like, it's so funny, dude. Because I tried so hard.
The failed snapshots that you have, and I'll post them up on the screen as we're talking about this. I'll make a little collage of me looking like an idiot on screen. It'll be a good time for everybody.
I'm sure everybody is like that. It's probably just very hard to take a picture of somebody when they don't know they're getting their.
You know what? I think it's a special talent that you have, because whenever you take snapshots of so you guys don't know this, but like we'll go through and try to find a thumbnail for the video and stuff. And if Tyler's the one editing for the week, because we switch off every other week, Tyler has the best time in the world just sending me the most ridiculous pictures of like me looking like a total idiot with my mouth hanging open.
Look at your phone right now. I'm sending you the ones that I just want to get a reaction video. You see the first one?
What is wrong with me? What's wrong with my actual face? All right, we'll put these up so everybody else can see.
Dude, look at me, dude. You can tell I know I'm getting my picture taken.
Yeah, you're the one taking it. Look at this. I want everybody to know that this is what Tyler thinks his best face is when he's getting his picture taken. You look like you're trying to be the world's most interesting man. You got like one eyebrow elevated.
No, I was trying to